let's tell you why climate change at least is top of the agenda. Because this year in particular, India has witnessed what climate change can do to us. From untimely floods in Kerala to cyclones in the Arabian Sea to the increasing frequency of landslides in Himalayas. The last 6 months have been like no other. We've seen unnatural, unprecedented climate events, clearly suggesting that India in particular is heading for a potential climate emergency. And that brings me to my first guest today. I'm joined by someone who is now making climate change really the key aspect of his writings. He is a Sahitya Akademi Award winner, Professor Amitav Ghosh, whose most recent book just out, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, once again focuses on the climate change challenge. Appreciate your joining us there, Professor Amitav Ghosh from New York. Your recent book, Amitav Ghosh, traces how the trade of nutmegs in the islands of Indonesia enriched people there, but then led to the rampant exploitation by colonial powers. Are you seeing similar stories in a way in the Indian context? Amitav Ghosh, your most recent book is looking at the exploitation of the trade of nutmeg in Indonesia, how it enriched people led to the rampant exploitation. Now we are seeing similar stories, some are suggesting across India, in the kind of exploitation of the environment, which many believe is a key issue that deserves greater public attention than it is at the moment. Do you believe that climate change, with this big summit held there in Glasgow, is at the center in a way?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Especially in central India, the forests are just being opened up to mining companies. The forest peoples are being shoved off their land. They're being essentially shoved into reservations, much like Native American and the First Peoples were in Canada, in Australia. It's exactly, we're just going through a replay of this appalling history, And, I know most Indians pay no attention at all to what's happening in the Adivasi areas, but I do. And it's an extreme crisis that they're in now. They're just being shunted off their lands. No one is paying attention. And, one of the worst aspects of it is that the Forest Department, just like their counterparts in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, earlier in the 20th century, the Forest Department is playing the role of, helping, corporate interests enter these previously protected areas.
But there are those, Amitav Ghosh, who will say that for countries like India, we need to put livelihoods above all else. They argue that climate change is a kind of Western elitism at work, that it is the richer countries who really need to answer the tougher questions, for example, on carbon emissions, while we in India need to, for now, worry about basic livelihoods. How do you look at this as a writer, as someone who's tracked this issue for years, this sort of constant debate that this is Western elitism at work versus the need for livelihoods in India?
Look at the absurdity of that position. For a forest person who's shoved off his land, he's lost his basic livelihood. How is he going to earn his basic livelihood after that? Mm-hmm. Who is going to get rich off this? It's not ordinary people. The people who are going to get rich are a few crony capitalists. Mm-hmm. Who are already incredibly rich. They're billionaires, mm-hmm. So in fact, the question is absolutely the other way around. The people who actually had livelihoods are losing their livelihoods, mm-hmm. So, that question really does not make sense in a way. And, you can see this happening across the country. We were talking about the resource curse. Mm-hmm. The resource curse has really struck Jharkhand in such a terrible way. Look at these uranium mines and, it's often forest peoples who become the miners, and they're exposed to all kinds of environmental hazards. Many of them fall terribly ill. There are very high rates of cancer and so on. So, if you look at the bauxite mines in Odisha, it's a horrifying thing. Mm-hmm. Bauxite mining is the most environmentally destructive thing there is. Basically, you just have to sort of remove an entire hill mm-hmm. In order to get at the bauxite. I mean, in what sense are we saying that this is going to benefit ordinary people? It's not.
You know, these debates, though, have been taking place over the last few years. There are those who keep saying the country needs much more infrastructure, more power projects. Now, at times, this will require a cost-benefit analysis if it's going through a forested area, for example. There are those who argue that climate change activists are a roadblock to these major infrastructure projects. How do you see it when the debate gets pitched in such binaries within a certain section of this country?
Look, I think, there are many models of capitalism. It's not the case that capitalism has only a single model. We have adopted the American model rather than the East Asian model, which is the model that Japan and South Korea followed. The model there was much, much less resource intensive. Japan basically doesn't have resources of that kind. It doesn't have, like vast oil fields and iron mines and so on. But what they did instead was that they created a model that was very labor intensive, not resource intensive. It was education intensive. It was labor intensive. That is the kind of model that we should be following. But in fact, the model that we've adopted is the model. The Anglo-American model, which is really completely dependent on just ruining your landscapes, on just extracting what you can from the land and getting away with it. Rajdeep, you are connected to Goa. You know what iron mining has done in Goa, and to the point where actually the courts shut it down, and for which really many, many Goans have been so grateful. Is that what we want to see happening across the length and breadth of India?
No, absolutely, you're right. Our netas need to walk the talk. It's one thing to have a summit in Glasgow, but world leaders need to walk the talk. You mentioned Goa there, which is being actually pushed as a coal hub. And we've seen in this year itself in Goa and indeed across the west coast of the country, unusual climatic development, cyclone, flash floods, deforestation. We are seeing it in Uttarakhand, one of the worst floods that state has had. And several parts of India witnessing these kind of climatic changes they've never seen. Temperatures are up higher than ever before. It appears we will require climate change to become a central issue. Will it require, though, I wonder, a terrible disaster for us to really wake up to the reality of what's happening, especially along the coastal belt of the country, the west coast?
Well, I wish I could say that one or two disasters would wake the country up, but it's perfectly clear that that's not going to happen. You're mentioning what's happening along the west coast of the country because actually that part of the country attracts a lot of attention, Goa, Bombay, Kerala. But in fact, there's been an utter disaster unfolding across so many parts of India because of the drought, the prolonged drought that we see. In Bundelkhand, for example, huge tracts of farmland have been abandoned by people simply because they can't grow anything over there. This is an equally terrible disaster. People don't notice it because it happens slowly. It's not a spectacular disaster. The disasters that you're talking about, the cyclones and so on, they're spectacular disasters. But in fact, the way that climate change usually unfolds is as a kind of slow violence, And that's what actually we are seeing much more of. If you just consider the enormous brown cloud of aerosols that stretches across the Indian subcontinent today, stretches well out into the Arabian Sea, in fact. I mean, that's a kind of, it's an unbelievable environmental disaster in the sense that everyone who lives under this brown cloud is inhaling terrible pollutants.
Amitav Ghosh, on the climate emergency that's facing the country, appreciate your joining us on a day when world leaders have gathered there in Glasgow. Hopefully, they will reach some kind of a consensus. Thanks very much.